11 friends vanished without a trace during a forest camp trip. Years later, shocking new evidence reopens the case, revealing secrets darker than anyone imagined. What really happened to the triplets and the others? Watch the full story to uncover the haunting truth. If you love suspense and mysteries, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a chilling tale. The forest around Ashwood Camp had a way of swallowing sound. On some mornings, the only thing you could hear was the low hum of insects and the distant rush of the Ash River, winding its way through the valley like a dark vein. It was a place that had been part of the town's memory for generations. Scouts went there for summer programs, hikers used its trails, and in the evenings, the tree line seemed to close in, turning the camp into its own little world. August 17, 2011, was no different. At least, it didn't seem so at first. It was the last week of summer break, and 12 children were attending the Forest Youth Program. 3 sets of siblings, a few cousins, and among them, the Parker's triplets, Emily, Noah, and Grace, all 11 years old. The triplets were easy to spot, not just because they looked alike in the same way a reflection looks like its source, but because they moved together, spoke over each other's sentences, and carried the same boundless, nervy energy that made them both adored and exhausting to supervise. That morning, the counselors planned a final excursion before the camp closed for the season. A team hike to the old logging road and back, a path that looped through denser sections of pine before opening to a clearing used decades ago by lumber workers. The idea was simple. Walk there in 2 hours, rest for 30 minutes, and head back before the afternoon heat thickened. The 12 kids were excited, their voices ricocheting off the cabins as they packed water bottles and trail snacks. The triplets' parents, Daniel and Rebecca Parker, had driven them to the camp that Sunday, trusting the familiar place and its reputation. The couple had been through that same camp themselves as teenagers, and they knew the faces of most staff members. Leaving the kids, there had been easy, natural. What they didn't know, what no one could have known, was that they would never again see their children come home in the same way. The hike began at exactly 9:47 a.m., as recorded by one counselor's watch. The weather was almost unnervingly perfect, cloudless sky, temperature hovering at 74 degrees, the faint scent of damp earth left from a light overnight drizzle. The group moved in 2 loose lines, a counselor at the front and one at the rear, with the children stretched in between. The trail was well-worn for the first half hour. There was chatter, laughter, and occasional complaints about the incline. By the time they reached the narrowing path through denser pines, the air had cooled, and the light shifted into the dim green of filtered sun. This was where the first oddity occurred. One of the counselors, Janet, noticed Emily whispering to Noah and Grace while pointing toward a cluster of trees just off the main trail. She assumed it was nothing, a shared sibling game or secret, but she remembered it later how intent they looked, as if they were listening for something. By 10:33 a.m., the group reached the logging road clearing. The counselors unpacked snacks, and the kids scattered across the grass. Some sat in small circles. Others wandered to the edge where the clearing met the forest again. The triplets, as always, stuck together, joined by 3 other children, Mason and Lily from town, and Oliver, the shy boy from the city. They stood near the tree line, talking in low voices. When the break ended, the counselors called everyone back. 11 children returned to the group, not 12. At first, it wasn't panic. It was mild confusion, assuming one child was still behind a tree or hadn't heard the call. Janet walked toward the spot where she'd last seen the triplets, but the space was empty. She called their names: Emily, Noah, Grace. Her voice echoed back too quickly. 5 minutes passed. 10. The other counselor began counting heads again, as if maybe it was a mistake, maybe they were hidden in the cluster. But the number stayed the same, 9 kids in sight, plus the 2 counselors. They spread out, searching the clearing perimeter. The grass bent where small feet had moved through, leading toward the forest on the opposite side. Janet followed the trail for 20 feet before it simply stopped. The footprints ended as if the children had stepped onto something hard or had been lifted away entirely. By 11:02 a.m., the counselors had to make a decision. One stayed with the remaining 9 children. The other ran back down the trail to camp to alert the staff. The hike back took her 38 minutes, during which she kept glancing over her shoulder, feeling an irrational certainty that something was pacing her from the trees. When camp staff and local volunteers arrived at the clearing, the search began in earnest. They combed the nearby woods, calling the triplets names. Every minute that passed without a response turned the air heavier. By 2:45 p.m., the local police were on site. They formed grid searches, brought in tracking dogs, and followed any sign they could find. Snapped twigs, slight depressions in moss, a candy wrapper that might have belonged to one of the children. But the dogs kept circling back in confusion, as if whatever scent they had found simply vanished beyond a certain point. Rebecca and Daniel Parker were both at work when they got the call. Rebecca remembered the exact ring of her phone, the way the light in her office looked that day, how the voice on the other end was too careful in its phrasing. By the time she reached the camp with Daniel, hours had passed. The scene that met them was surreal. Dozens of people walking through the forest with sticks, calling names that got swallowed by the trees. Police radios crackled. A command post had been set up at the edge of the dirt road, with maps spread across hoods of vehicles. Rebecca didn't fully understand what was happening until a female officer gently took her aside and said, "We haven't located them yet." That phrasing, "yet," was supposed to offer hope, but it drained the blood from her face. Night fell with no sign of the triplets. Floodlights were set up, and the search continued into the small hours. At 3:17 a.m., Daniel was sitting on the hood of their car, staring at the forest line, when Rebecca began pacing and muttering, "They're out there, they're just hiding, they're just hiding." Her voice had the unsteady rhythm of someone trying to force belief into existence. Over the next 72 hours, the search expanded. State police, rescue teams, helicopters, drones, and even local hunters familiar with the forest were brought in. 11 other children from the camp were questioned. How did the triplets seem that morning? Did they say where they were going? The answers were frustratingly vague. They were just talking. They were looking at something in the woods. They said they'd be right back. The Parkers stopped sleeping. They remained on site, walking into the forest themselves despite being told to leave it to the professionals. Daniel carried a flashlight even in daylight, scanning every shadow. Rebecca began approaching strangers, asking if they had seen her kids, holding up photos until her hands shook. The media arrived by the end of the week. News vans parked along the road, and reporters set up near the camp entrance. Interviews were given, pleas made on camera. Rebecca's voice cracked when she said, "If someone has them, please just bring them back. We don't care how or why. We just need them home." But days turned into weeks. The official search scaled back. Leads grew cold. Whatever had happened that morning at Ashwood Camp left no clear trace. No ransom note, no signs of struggle, no evidence of an accident. The absence was total. Months later, the Parkers' marriage began to fray under the weight of not knowing. Conversations turned into arguments. Arguments turned into silence. Rebecca joined online forums for missing children, while Daniel pored over topographical maps of the forest, memorizing every ridge and hollow. Both carried the same wound, but they grieved in different, jagged ways. A year passed, then 2, then 5. Public interest faded, though the Parkers kept their children's faces on billboards and flyers. Every new call from an unknown number made Rebecca's heart lurch. Every knock at the door made Daniel brace for news that never came. The mystery sat in their lives like a locked room. Until, on the 10th anniversary of the disappearance, a brown envelope arrived at their doorstep with no return address. Inside, a single photograph of 3 figures standing at the edge of a forest. They were turned away from the camera, but the size, the build, even the posture, looked like Emily, Noah, and Grace. The photograph sat between them on the kitchen table for nearly an hour before either of them spoke. Rebecca stared at it as though it were a living thing that might change if she blinked. Daniel had been the first to lift it from the envelope, holding it at arm's length, afraid his hands might smudge some crucial detail. It wasn't glossy like a store print. It was matte, grainy, the colors muted and weathered, as though it had been developed years ago. In the frame, three figures stood side by side at the edge of a tree line, backs to the camera, faces obscured. They were wearing hooded jackets, the kind you might find at any outdoor store, but the heights, the proportions. Even a slight inward turn of Grace's left foot, it was all there. Rebecca whispered, "It's them." Her voice didn't rise. It fell, heavy with something between terror and hope. Daniel didn't answer right away. His mind was working in tight, stifled circles. If this is them, where was it taken? Who took it? Why send it now? He flipped the photo over. The back was blank. No date, no writing, no smudged fingerprints, nothing. By the second hour, they were already arguing. Rebecca wanted to call the police immediately, hand the envelope over untouched. Daniel wanted to make a copy first, keep something the sender couldn't take away from them. At 3:19 p.m., Rebecca dialed Detective Marlon Hayes, the only officer from the original case who still returned their calls. His voice on the other end shifted from polite to sharp the moment she mentioned the envelope. Within 2 hours, Hayes was at their kitchen table, sliding the photograph into a plastic evidence sleeve. "Could be your kids," he said, careful not to promise. "Could also be a sick prank. Either way, it's enough to reopen the case file." Rebecca flinched at the word prank. She wanted to believe the photograph meant something, that it was a breadcrumb left intentionally for them. The next day, Hayes brought the image to the state crime lab. They scanned it at the highest resolution, enhancing every shadow and texture. The results were inconclusive. No identifiable landmarks, no clear facial features. But the jackets, the rightmost figure's coat had a faded logo on the back, barely visible unless magnified. An old Ashwood camp emblem, discontinued years before the disappearance. That detail sent a tremor through Rebecca's chest. She remembered packing that exact jacket for Noah. Within a week, the media caught wind of the new development. The story of the Ashwood triplets resurfaced, headlines thick with speculation. Interviews were requested. Rebecca refused most, but Daniel appeared on a late-night local segment, holding the photograph in his palm like something fragile. "If anyone knows where this was taken," he said, "please come forward." But the calls that came in were not what they expected. One was from a man named Richard Lyle, a retired forest ranger who claimed to have seen 3 kids that looked like the missing ones years ago near a section of forest 15 miles from Ashwood. He hadn't reported it then, he admitted, because he thought they were just locals cutting through. Another was from a woman named Teresa Ward, who said she recognized the pattern of the tree line in the photo. It looked like the western edge of the old Miller property, a stretch of land long abandoned after a series of mysterious accidents in the 1990s. The Miller property was fenced now, posted with no trespassing signs, owned by some private entity that kept its name off public records. Detective Hayes followed up on both leads. The ranger's memory was too vague, but Teresa's claim, that one stuck. The Miller property was less than 4 miles from the clearing where the triplets vanished. If they had somehow wandered or been led there, it could explain why the search teams never found a trace. Still, the land was sealed. Legally, Hayes couldn't just walk onto it. That's when Daniel decided they couldn't wait. On the night of September 3rd, he parked his truck on the dirt shoulder near the old West Gate. The fence there was rusted and bent at the bottom, leaving just enough space to crawl through. Rebecca came with him, flashlight in hand, despite his protests. The air beyond the fence felt different, colder, heavier, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. They moved slowly, their beams of light catching on skeletal remains of cabins and rusted machinery. Then, just past midnight, Rebecca froze. She was staring at something nailed to a tree. It was a small wooden sign, weather-worn and warped, but still legible. Cabin 6. The sight of it punched through her like ice water. Cabin 6 was the one the triplets had slept in their first year at Ashwood Camp. But there had never been any official Cabin 6 in that location. They pushed on, following a faint trail until the ground dropped into a shallow gully. There, in the beam of Daniel's flashlight, they saw it. A a structure half swallowed by vines and moss. The number 6 carved into the frame above the door. Rebecca stepped forward, her pulse drumming in her ears. The door was ajar. Inside, the smell was a mix of damp wood and something metallic. Against the far wall stood 3 small beds, neatly made. On one of them lay a single item, a worn children's sneaker, size 4, with a faded green lace. Rebecca recognized it instantly. It was Grace's. They didn't hear the footsteps until they were close, too close. Someone was in the cabin with them. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, as if the person knew exactly where they were stepping to avoid creaking boards. Daniel's first instinct was to grab Rebecca's arm and back toward the door, but as he turned, the beam of his flashlight swept across the corner. A figure stood there, tall, wearing a dark parka with the hood drawn so low that the face was nothing but shadow. The air in the cabin thickened. "Who's there?" Daniel's voice cracked, louder than he meant it to be. His other hand instinctively moved in front of Rebecca. The figure didn't answer. They just stood, unmoving as if weighing something. Then, without warning, they stepped forward into the thin cone of light. The hood still hid the face, but Daniel caught a glimpse of the hands, pale, with thin white scars across the knuckles. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was low, rough, and oddly flat, as though speaking was an effort. "They don't want you here." Rebecca's grip tightened around the flashlight. "Where are our children?" Her voice wavered between plea and fury. The figure tilted their head slightly, like a dog catching an unfamiliar sound. Then they said something that landed like a hammer in the small room. "You think they left?" Daniel took a step forward. "What do you mean?" But the figure moved first, slipping sideways toward the rear wall, where a door Rebecca hadn't noticed before hung half open. They disappeared into the darkness beyond, their steps silent. For a moment, the Parkers just stood frozen, the sound of their own breathing loud in their ears. Then Daniel lunged toward the back door. It opened into a short hallway that smelled of mildew and earth. A faint light glowed ahead, not from electricity, but from some kind of lantern. They followed it, their feet crunching on damp leaves that had blown in from outside. The hall ended at a hatch in the floor, the kind you'd see in old storm cellars. It was open, the lantern resting on the ground beside it, and from the hole rose a smell that made Rebecca's stomach twist. Stale air, dust, and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. There was no sound from below. Daniel crouched, shining his light into the hatch. Wooden steps descended into darkness, but the beam caught the edge of something hanging on the far wall. Another photograph, larger this time, tacked to the boards with a nail. He could see enough to know it was of children, but not their faces. Rebecca was about to climb down when a noise split the air, a sharp metallic snap, like a trap springing shut. Daniel jerked his head toward the door. Outside, a set of lights was cutting through the trees. Headlamps. Multiple. The fear that surged in Rebecca wasn't just for themselves. It was the sense of being caught somewhere no one wanted them to be, where the rules were not the same. Daniel yanked the hatch closed and grabbed the lantern. They slipped back into the main cabin, ducking behind the farthest bed just as voices reached the doorway. "Can't leave it open," one man was saying. His voice was steady but irritated. "You know the rules." Another voice, lower, replied, "They were here. I saw the light." Rebecca's pulse hammered so hard she thought it would give them away. Daniel's hand was clamped over hers, holding her still. Boots scraped on the wooden floor. One set moved toward the rear hall. The other lingered near the beds. Rebecca didn't dare breathe. She could see the shadow of a man's arm sweep across the mattress inches from her face. Then, mercifully, one of the men called from the back. Nothing. Must have been animals. The steps retreated, the door creaked, and a moment later the sounds faded into the forest. They waited another full minute before moving. Daniel checked the doorway, then whispered, "We can't stay here." They slipped out into the night, keeping low, moving fast. The forest beyond cabin 6 seemed darker than before, the silence deeper. By the time they crawled back under the fence to their truck, Rebecca's legs were trembling. Neither of them spoke until they were halfway home. It was only then that Rebecca realized something. She still had the lantern clutched in her hands. And inside, wedged at the base of the glass, was a folded scrap of paper. She unfolded it under the dashboard light. The handwriting was uneven, almost childlike, but the words made her blood run cold. "We didn't leave. They keep us." The truck's engine hummed in the dark, but neither Daniel nor Rebecca moved to shift into gear. The note lay in Rebecca's lap, the words staring back at them like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. "We didn't leave. They keep us." It wasn't a plea, not exactly. It felt more like a statement, a grim confirmation of something the Parkers had been too afraid to believe. Daniel was the first to speak. "If that's from them, then they're alive." His voice was tight, almost breaking under the weight of hope and terror mixed together. Rebecca's grip on the paper tightened. "Words from someone who wants us to think they're alive." She hated saying it, but the years had taught her that false hope was just as cruel as despair. Still, the words had a weight to them. They didn't sound like something a stranger would invent. They sounded like truth. Daniel drove the rest of the way home in silence. That night, Rebecca couldn't bring herself to sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with the note under the glow of a single lamp, tracing the letters with her eyes. The uneven handwriting, some letters leaned left, others right, as if written quickly. She remembered how Grace had always slanted her G's in exactly that way. By morning, Detective Hayes was at their door. They handed him the note and the lantern. He read the message twice before speaking. "If this is legitimate, we're looking at an active captivity situation. Which means, Daniel cut in, we don't wait another 10 years to do something about it." Hayes didn't argue, but his face had that guarded expression Rebecca recognized. There was something he wasn't saying. Over the next 3 days, Hayes pushed through the legal process to get access to the Miller property. The owners were a shell corporation based out of state, with no clear individual listed on any documents. When Hayes finally reached a legal representative, the answer was short and sharp: private land. No public access. No comment. That night, Daniel decided he and Rebecca couldn't just sit in their house waiting for paperwork. They needed eyes on the place again. They parked farther away this time, taking the long route on foot under cover of darkness. The forest was damp, the smell of wet pine sharp in the air. They moved toward Cabin 6, but stopped when they saw movement ahead. 2 figures carrying what looked like large crates, heading deeper into the property. Daniel and Rebecca crouched behind a fallen log, watching the faint swing of the figures' headlamps. The crates didn't look heavy, but they were handled with care, as if the contents mattered. Rebecca's skin prickled. "What's in those?" she whispered. Daniel didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the narrow trail the figures were following. Once they disappeared into the dark, the Parkers moved. They followed at a distance, careful not to break twigs underfoot. The trail wound downhill, the air growing cooler with each step. Eventually, they saw a faint orange glow ahead, firelight. From behind a cluster of trees, they could see it clearly now. An old hunting lodge, half hidden under ivy, with smoke curling from its chimney. The figure set the crates down on the porch, knocked twice on the wooden frame, and stepped back. The door opened just enough for someone inside to reach out. Pale hands again, quick but deliberate. One by one, the crates were pulled inside. The door shut. Rebecca's heart was pounding. She couldn't see inside the lodge, but she could hear something faint, muffled voices. High-pitched, rapid. Children. Daniel looked at her. "We have to get closer." They moved to the side, circling the lodge until they reached a broken window partially covered with a nailed plank. Daniel eased one corner free, just enough for them to peer inside. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of the fireplace. Against the far wall sat 4 children, thin, pale, their eyes downcast. They weren't chained, but they didn't move freely either. Rebecca's stomach clenched. None of them were her triplets, but they were someone's children. And then, in the shadowed corner, she saw something else. 3 beds pushed together, made neatly, each with a folded blanket at the foot. On one of the pillows lay a hair clip she recognized instantly. A faded pink plastic butterfly that Emily had worn almost every day this summer she disappeared. Before she could say anything, a voice cut through the room. A man's voice, deep and commanding. "Lights out. No talking. The children obeyed instantly, slipping into their beds without a sound. Daniel pulled her back from the window. We have to go. Now. They moved as quickly and quietly as they could, but halfway back up the trail, a beam of light swept over them from behind. A voice shouted, "Stop right there!" Daniel grabbed Rebecca's hand, yanking her into the trees. They ran without looking back, branches clawing at their clothes. The light behind them wavered, then grew faint. By the time they reached their truck, they were breathless, shaking. In the cab, Rebecca clutched Daniel's arm. That was them, Daniel. That was their beds. They've been there. Daniel stared out at the dark road ahead. Then we're not stopping until we bring them back. But in his eyes, Rebecca saw something else, a fear he hadn't spoken yet. The kind of fear that came from knowing you weren't the only ones hunting in these woods. The drive home was a blur of wet roads and restless headlights. Rebecca kept glancing in the side mirror, half expecting to see a pair of headlights tailing them through the dark. Daniel's hands were locked on the wheel, knuckles pale, his jaw set in a way that told her he was running every scenario in his head. By the time they pulled into the driveway, the adrenaline had burned down into a gnawing, vibrating exhaustion. Neither of them spoke until they were in the safety of the kitchen, the door locked, the curtains drawn. Rebecca leaned against the counter, still breathing hard. We saw other kids in there, Daniel. That means this isn't just our family. This is bigger. Daniel nodded slowly. And that means we can't handle it alone anymore. At dawn, they called Detective Hayes. They left nothing out. The lodge, the crates, the children, the hair clip on the pillow. Hayes didn't interrupt once, but when they finished, his face on a video call was grim. What you just described, if true, we're not looking at a simple missing persons case. This is organized. Whoever's behind it knows how to keep people hidden, and they're not working alone. Rebecca leaned toward the screen. Then you need to go in now. Don't wait for warrants and paperwork. Go in before they move them. Hayes exhaled heavily. It's not that simple. If we rush and they scatter, we lose everyone. And from what you're describing, they're willing to go to lengths to keep this buried. Those words sat in the air like a lead. 2 days later, the story leaked. Rebecca never found out if it was Hayes or someone else in the department, but suddenly the local news was running with a headline. Parents claim new lead in decade OLD Ashwood camp disappearance. The segment aired footage of the original search from 2011, the triplet school photos, and a heavily blurred shot of the Miller property's fence. Reporters swarmed the Parkers' driveway. Microphones were shoved forward with questions like knives. Do you believe your children are still alive? Have you been threatened? Who's keeping them? Daniel tried to keep his answers calm, but Rebecca could see the tension building in him, a pressure that was going to break sooner rather than later. That night, Hayes called with a warning. Be careful what you say on camera. If they know you've been there, they'll see you as a problem to be solved. Rebecca felt her stomach turn. They? Who are we talking about, Hayes? There was a long pause before he answered. Let's just say, there are people in this county who can make things disappear without leaving a trace. And they've been doing it for a long time. The next morning, a plain white envelope was wedged under their front door. Inside was a single photograph, blurry, night vision green. It showed two figures standing outside the Parkers' own house. One was holding something long and thin. The other was looking directly into the camera. There was no note, no signature, just the image. Rebecca's knees nearly buckled. Daniel grabbed the photo from her and studied it, his face hardening into something colder than she'd ever seen. They're not just keeping our kids. They're watching us. Later that same day, Hayes arranged for the Parkers to meet with a federal contact off record. They drove to a gas station 30 miles out of town and waited in their truck until a black SUV pulled up. A man in a dark jacket slid into the back seat without introducing himself. I don't have time for hand-holding, he said. If what you're saying is true, then your kids are part of a larger operation we've been circling for years. But you need to understand, if you push this wrong, you won't just lose them. You'll lose yourselves. Rebecca turned in her seat. So what do we do? Just sit here and wait while they rot in that place. The man's eyes flicked to hers. No, you'll help us get inside. But when it starts, you follow my lead exactly. Because if they realize we're coming before we are ready, everyone in that lodge disappears into thin air, and you never hear from them again. They agreed, because there was no other choice left. That night, back at home, Daniel found something else in the lantern they had brought from Cabin 6. Tucked under the base, wrapped in a strip of cloth, was a small Polaroid. It was faded and grainy, but the faces were unmistakable. Emily, Noah, and Grace, sitting at a wooden table, their hair longer, their faces older, but their eyes unmistakable, and scrawled in uneven handwriting along the bottom. "We hear you. Don't stop." I barely slept that night. Every creak in the house sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind against the window seemed to whisper secrets I didn't want to hear. The events of the past weeks had left me drained, but my mind refused to rest. I kept going over every conversation, every smile, every subtle change in behavior that I had ignored before. They all lined up now, like puzzle pieces I had refused to put together. By the time dawn arrived, I had made a decision. I couldn't keep floating in this limbo between knowing and confronting. It was destroying me from the inside out. So I got up, made coffee as if it were any other morning, and sat at the table waiting for him to come down. He looked tired. I was a little bloodshot, but still tried to give me that same charming smile. I didn't smile back. "I know," I said simply. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me. "I know everything." For a moment, he froze. Not a blink, not a breath. Then he gave this half-smile, the kind that people use when they're trying to play dumb. "Know what?" he asked. I leaned forward, my eyes fixed on his. "Don't insult me. I've seen the messages. I've heard the calls. And I know where you've been going when you said you were working late." He sat back, exhaled sharply, and rubbed his face with his hands. "It's not what you think," he started, but I cut him off. "Don't lie again," I said. "You've had enough chances to be honest, and every time you chose to deceive me. But you know what? This isn't about you anymore. This is about me, and what I'm going to do next." I stood up, took my coffee, and walked out of the kitchen. I didn't slam the door. I didn't shout. My calmness seemed to rattle him more than any explosion of anger could have. That afternoon, I began quietly setting things in motion. I contacted a lawyer, a good one, and explained the situation in detail. He didn't interrupt me much, just took notes and asked a few sharp questions. By the end of the meeting, I had a plan. One that would protect me, take away his leverage, and make sure the truth was no longer a shadow in our house, but a glaring light he couldn't hide from. I also reached out to a few mutual friends, the ones I trusted, not to gossip, but to ensure I wasn't isolated when the storm broke. I knew from experience how people could be swayed by half-truths and manipulated stories. I wanted my side out there first, clear and undeniable. That night, when he came home, I was already waiting in the living room. There was no dinner on the table, no casual conversation, just a folder sitting on the coffee table between us. "What's this?" he asked cautiously. "Evidence," I said. "Messages, photos, dates, times, and a list of people who now know the truth. You could try to deny it, but the story's already out. You don't get to rewrite it this time." He stared at the folder for a long time, his hands tightening into fists. But he didn't open it. He knew exactly what was inside. "This is going to destroy everything," he finally said. "No," I replied softly. "You destroyed everything. I'm just making sure the rubble doesn't bury me too." For the first time since this whole mess began, I felt in control. Not happy, not yet, but steady. And I knew that whatever came next, I wouldn't face it with my head bowed. I would face it with my eyes open and on my own terms. The days after the verdict felt strange, almost surreal. 4 months my life had revolved around courtrooms, testimonies, documents, and endless nights planning each step of my revenge. Now that it was over, the silence felt heavier than I expected. My cousin, once the person I trusted with my future, was in prison, and my inheritance, what my parents had worked for their entire lives, was finally back in my hands. I should have felt nothing but victory, but instead I felt a deep, quiet sadness. Not for him. He had chosen his path, but for the fact that greed had destroyed something that could never be repaired. Family bonds are fragile. Once broken, they don't always grow back. Still, I refused to let this ending be only about pain. I decided to do something with my inheritance that would honor my parents' memory. They had always believed in education and helping others, so I created a small scholarship fund in their name. Each year, a young person from our hometown would receive support to pursue their studies. It wasn't just money. It was a way to turn what had been stolen into something that would grow, something that could not be corrupted by lies. People in the community began to look at me differently, not just as the woman who had exposed a family betrayal, but as someone who had fought for what was right and then used her victory to give back. Even those who had doubted me at first approached me with quiet words of respect. I learned something important. Revenge might begin with anger, but justice must end with purpose. Without purpose, victory is hollow. One afternoon, months later, I received a letter. The handwriting was messy, rushed, but familiar. It was from my cousin. Inside was a single page. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He knew I wasn't ready to give it, but he admitted everything. He wrote that in prison he had realized the emptiness of chasing wealth at the cost of relationships. He said he had started teaching other inmates to read and write, something I never imagined he would do. For a moment, I wondered if maybe he truly could change. I didn't reply. Not yet, but I kept the letter in a drawer, not as a reminder of his betrayal, but as proof that even the worst stories can have a spark of change inside them. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm. The house felt different now. Less like a place where I had been trapped in grief, and more like a place I had reclaimed. I would sit by the window in the evenings, the golden light spilling across the floor, and I would think of my parents. I hoped they would be proud, not just because I fought back, but because I refused to let bitterness be the final chapter. I had won, not just in court, not just in reclaiming my inheritance, but in reclaiming myself. And in the quiet of those evenings, I finally understood that true victory isn't just about defeating someone else. It's about building something stronger in the place where they tried to break you. And so, the story ended not with rage, but with a deep, unshakable peace.